Welcome to Hub Dialogues. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at the Hub. I'm honored to be joined today by David Frum for another episode of our bi-weekly video and podcast series, From Dialogues. David, as viewers and listeners know, is a staff writer at The Atlantic, the author of several books, and a highly coveted guest and commentator on various cable television programs. We're honored to provide him with a platform to share his insights and analysis on key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. Today's episode is being recorded a day after the U.S. Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, arrived for an official visit in Ottawa and less than 2 weeks before the upcoming midterm elections in the United States. I thought it was a good time to talk about the Canada-U.S. relationship in an era of ongoing political acrimony in Washington. David, thanks for joining us once again.
Always good to be with you. Thank you.
As you know, Canadians overwhelmingly favored Joe Biden in the 2020 presidential election. One poll at the time, for instance, found that 84% of Canadians said they'd vote for Biden if they could. Yet, one can argue that his administration hasn't been great for Canada. It may be less crude and unpredictable than the Trump administration, but on a series of files, including the Keystone Pipeline, Buy America, and our exclusion from the US, UK, Australia naval agreement, it feels like Canada is at best an afterthought these days. It's notable, for instance, that Canada is the last G7 country that the Secretary of State has visited. I mean, let's start big picture. What do you make of the state of the bilateral relationship under the Biden administration?
Well, it has to be stressed at the beginning that the Canada-U.S. relationship always moves within a band from excellent to very good. And it's so complex that it is almost beyond the mind of a human being even to comprehend it. It includes not just the things you mentioned, but migratory birds, traffic congestion on the Ambassador Bridge, acid rain issues. I mean, just standards for electrical wiring. I mean, just millions of issues being worked on every day by people who have no conception that they're working on the U.S.-Canada relationship. They just think they're protecting the migratory birds or the monarch butterflies, and they are talking to their counterparts in an American state 1,000 miles away. I think that part shows some light into the point about Blinken not visiting Canada or visiting Canada last. That's not a slight. That's about proximity. That actually making a trip for an American Secretary of State to book a trip to Ottawa when Ottawa and Washington are in the same time zone, when Canadians are constantly in the United States, and when in fact so much of the U.S.-Canada relationship does not go through the foreign policy apparatus. It's not a slight, it's just a nature of the I don't know how often the trade counterparts have met, but I would bet often because they have those issues. All of that said, Canada does have some things to worry about with the Biden administration. As we've discussed on this platform before, the area of greatest continuity between Biden and Trump has been the Biden administration's suspicion of trade expansion. They have maintained many Trump trade protectionist policies. They have made zero commitment to trade expansion. They're just not interested in it. And with control of Congress once again coming down to the former industrial areas in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan, there's not a lot of hope for near-term improvement. So that's going to be a real point of vexation. And Canadians understandably prefer working with a less aggressive and belligerent and narrowly nationalistic administration, but those trade issues remain tender even with the Biden administration.
We'll come to the midterm elections and their potential implications for the bilateral relationship later in the conversation. But it sounds like the big news coming out of the Secretary's two-day visit is that Canada is joining the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which was created by the Biden administration and currently involves 13 other countries as something of a regional counterweight to Chinese influence. It seems to me, David, it raises bigger questions about our bilateral relationship with China. It's notable, for instance, that Canada's industry minister recently spoke for the first time about the need for decoupling. I guess the question for you is hawkishness vis-a-vis China on the part of Canada now the cost of doing business in Washington? Is it your sense that the administration thinks that Canada has been too weak on China?
Yeah. Canada was the target of a very specific targeted Chinese blackmail attempt involving the safety of Canadian citizens. So that was a sensitive point. Canada's always approached China with um, trade concerns first, migration and voting concerns second, and security concerns a very distant third, if at all. We saw that at the beginning of COVID, where the Canadian government really seemed motivated above all by fears of how acknowledging the risks of COVID would affect their voting position in Chinese Canadian communities rather than protecting the health and safety of Canadians. So that's been a problem, especially with this government. But all of this highlights the lopsidedness of Canada's state existence and the choices that Canadians have to make. In the realms of finance and economics, Canada is a major player. It is, it is a G7 country. It's not quite in the Britain-Japan level, but it's the next tier. If the United States and the EU are level one, and Britain and Japan are the next level, Canada is there with France and with Italy as an equivalent economic and financial power. But in every security dimension, Canada has elected to reduce its capacities to those of a very small country. Canada suddenly looks much less like a France or a Germany, and much more like like a Portugal. And that's the decision that Canadian governments have made, driven primarily for budgetary reasons. We've talked about this before, given also because Canadian career paths in the civil service do not reward those who want to work in security portfolios. And so Canada finds itself in a position where Canada's not slighted by not being invited to join the naval exercises. The question is, what assets would Canada bring? So if Canadians want to have more of a say in that spectrum of issues, along with the financial and economic, where they do have a lot of say, then they have to build those capacities, which means having world-class security services, world-class counterintelligence services. It means not sacrificing domestic security to ethnic vote seeking, whether it's China, whether it's Iran, whether it's Hezbollah. And that's been a constant problem for Canadian government. Conservative governments have had their own sins with Sikh communities and others. But because Canada is such a diverse immigrant country, because immigrant groups bring in all kinds of people, both the best and the worst, and because the worst sometimes are more organized than the best, Canadian governments have tended to make security secondary to vote seeking. And if you want to be a player in security, that has to change.
And one of Secretary Blinken's visits while in Canada is to a manufacturing plant in order to highlight the concept of so-called friendshoring. David, what do you think of this idea? Does it have potential? And how far should the Canadian-U.S. governments go to bring back production to North America?
I have to. I'm in one way. I'm the last of the free traders in Washington. I think I think we should be looking to buy the best product at the lowest price anywhere in the world. And there are cases where national security must trump, override free trade, economic efficiency concerns. But you need to be very careful, and especially when dealing with the Biden administration, whether you're dealing with a real security issue or whether you're just dealing with just a fancier excuse for protectionism. The Biden administration has strong protectionist tendencies. And so I would hope that for allied governments, including Canada, would say, what would Mackenzie King say about conscription? Conscription if necessary, not necessarily conscription. A friendshoring if necessary. But let's be sure it's necessary and that it's not a disguise for protectionism. And let's also not be the people. I think the China relationship is one where it would be wise not to be proactive. We should always be seeking the warmest possible relationship that China will allow. And we should never, ever, ever lose our hope that that relationship is going somewhere good and not accept that it is doomed to go somewhere bad. A lot of the things that people say falsely about the West and Russia are, I fear, in danger of becoming true of the West and China. We are in an escalatory cycle where we're each feeding each other's paranoia. And there is still lots of room, I believe, there's lots of room to try softer measures designed to get more cooperative results, and to continue to keep alive the hope that China can be a responsible member of a world trading community. It's not a democracy. It's not a respecter of rights. There's a lot to say about the terrible abuses happening to individuals within China. But in the economic realm, I think we want to be absolutely sure that China itself has left us no choice but state-led management of trade, because that should not be our decision. That has to be their decision.
Yeah, I would just say in parentheses for viewers and listeners, it is a big deal that Canada's industry minister has talked about decoupling in the past couple of weeks. That strikes me as a major development that one couldn't have anticipated, especially coming out of the Trudeau government, who, as you say, David, has been slower than others to start to think and talk differently about the country's relationship with China.
This decoupling may happen anyway, because it looks like there is some serious crisis brewing within the Chinese economy. And people have been predicting this now for a decade, that the crazy way they finance growth with debt from trapped savings. And people have been saying for a long time, this can't go on forever. And it wasn't true for a long time. That, I mean, the consequences didn't come, but it is true it can't go on forever. And sooner or later, it will stop. And maybe this is the year that it is stopping. So we may have a forced decoupling. Plus, China seems to be taking this extreme approach to COVID suppression that is, again, waging ruin upon its own internal economy.
Let's turn the conversation now to the midterm elections. We spoke soon after the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe versus Wade, and you astutely predicted that it would give the Democrats a shot in the arm. You were right. Congressional races tightened, though in recent days, the Republicans seem to be opening up something of a lead. Where do you think things stand? Help us understand the overall state of the elections.
Yeah. I think the abortion was very important in the summer. What has become very important in the fall is just what has happened to the price of the average mortgage. If you are looking to buy a new home and you are putting 20% down and financing 80%, your purchasing power has been effectively cut in half by interest rates. And that's not a problem just for new buyers, because the peak of the U.S. Real estate cycle pre-COVID was the year 2017. And the cheapest kind of mortgage you could get in 2017 was a 5-year mortgage that had a fixed rate, was a mortgage that had a fixed rate for 5 years and then reset. And guess what year all those 2017 mortgages are resetting right now? So there are a lot of people who own a home, not just young new buyers who are being priced out of the new market, but a lot of people who own a home, thought they could afford it, and are suddenly discovering they are struggling to keep up with the new mortgage, and they're agitated about that, understandably. So that's going to be powerful. And so I think there is a sense that a lot of races have broken. I think we've also seen some personal factors. I mean, there's this extraordinary race in Georgia where a famous football star, Herschel Walker, is now very credibly shown to have financed not one, but 2 abortions, one of which he sort of bullied, at least one of which he bullied the woman into. And pro-life voters in a pro-life state say, well, we didn't mean him. We meant bad people's abortions. Not good people's abortions. We don't want to stop those. So we're on our way, very likely. We've always been on our way to a Republican House of Representatives. It now looks more likely it'll be a Republican Senate too.
Let me take up that precise topic. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has lamented, both publicly and privately, according to reports, about the quality of some Republican Senate candidates, including Herschel Walker, who you mentioned, and Blake Masters in Arizona, amongst others. Do you want to help us understand the dynamics that produce these candidates? I can't help but feel, David, like we're back in 2010 and Republicans seem determined to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory.
Well, this is not a uniquely Republican problem. Look at the race in Pennsylvania. Actually, where both parties, the Republicans had the choice of a Pennsylvania native, successful businessman, active in state charities. They could have had him, and instead they got Dr. Oz, who peddled quack medicines on television. And the Democrats had a candidate named Connor Lamb, who was a veteran, I think a U.S. Navy veteran, served in Iraq with distinction, was a member of the Judge Advocate Corps that prosecuted cases in military justice, and physically fit and ready to member now of the U.S. House of Representatives, and they chose instead a man with the health conditions that, and never mind, that he was a Bernie Sanders supporter and had all kinds of weird views, that he was a health vulnerable person. And so both parties made bad decisions in that state. So part of it is a problem with party bases. And there's this question about how parties choose their candidates. So the Republicans do seem to have it worse. But Herschel, in the single worst candidate they have, which is Herschel Walker, they may be about to get away with it.
If we end up with divided government, what will be the consequences for the policy agenda in Washington? Are there areas where there may be scope for bipartisanship, like we saw, for instance, with the CHIPS Act, or are we headed towards the kind of dysfunction that we've seen in previous cycles of in which Congress and the White House find themselves on opposite sides?
Well, the scariest possibility ahead, and it's ahead very fast, is that Congress may reenact the debt ceiling showdowns of 2011. Now, these are games, I forget now which movie, is it Grease, where they have the game of chicken on the highway? These are games where no one actually intends to have a car crash. Both hope that through projecting commitment, they can force the other car to swerve before there's a disaster. But there are also terrible problems of communicating and signaling where a mistake can happen. And if you do have a mistake, you get a situation where the United States government defaults on obligations, and not just debts, but contracts, all kinds of. The United States government is the largest buyer of goods and services in the world. And if it turns out to be, and it operates on a series of, if you've ever sold to the US government, it's quite hard to become to go through the paperwork to get the first payment. But once you get it, they pay very regular. Once you get the system going, it's very regular. And so you have suppliers all over the earth, and especially inside North America, who are expecting regular payment of their bills by the United States government, never mind pensioners and hospitals and people like that. If you get a default on those obligations, whether it's the debt or the contracts, it could be a global financial catastrophe. And that could happen through misunderstanding. It could also happen because while Mitch McConnell in the Senate has a strong grip on his caucus, Kevin McCarthy in the House will be one of the weakest speakers seen in years, if not the weakest speaker of all time. And he has great difficulty controlling his caucus. You see this also in Ukraine policy. McConnell has made very clear he's a friend of Ukraine. He's on Ukraine's side. He personally went to Sweden and Finland to assure those governments that their application to join NATO would pass through the US Senate without difficulty. And it proceeded exactly as he said. He's been, and he's got the votes, and there's never been a question about them. McCarthy has waffled. I think in his heart, McCarthy's on the Ukraine side. He was photographed just yesterday wearing a pocket handkerchief in the colors of Ukraine. But he's afraid of his caucus, and he can't control them. And many of them are on the Russian side. And that's going to be a real issue too.
In the political environment you just described, what should the Canadian government be doing to advance the country's bilateral priorities? What, if anything, can we do, David, to cultivate allies and attention in Washington?
Yeah, well, Canada has a very able ambassador right now. But the key thing to bear in mind is the thing I said at the beginning. The relationship does not flow through the formal channels of diplomacy alone. Every Canadian premier who has contacts with adjacent state governors is doing Canada-U.S. relationships. Every environmental agency, every business. So it's more like domestic politics, really, than it is like international politics. And so, and I think many premiers have been very effective with this, but they need to be reminding their American counterparts that Canadian suppliers also have interests in being paid on time, and in there not being any kind of unnecessary artificially forced default. So keeping those lines of communications open in many places beyond the embassy is going to be very important. The ambassador will work with the Republicans in the Senate very successfully. And I think Canadians, like the rest of the world, are just going to be in a position of hoping that Kevin McCarthy is not as weak and feckless as he looks, that the worm does maybe have a spine somewhere inside its slithering body, and that he will be able to prevent the wild people in his caucus from doing all the damage that they're coming to Washington in order to do.
Let me just wrap up with one final question. We aren't to have a federal election in Canada until 2025. Is there anything occurring within the context of these midterm elections that Canadian politicians ought to take note of? Any issues or strategies or tactics that may inform a federal election, still 2 or 3 years out?
Yeah, well, I think the lesson is an important lesson is from Canada, from Australia before that, from every developed is the overwhelming power of the inflation issue. That this is not my point originally, but it's true. You have serious unemployment, 7, 8, 10%, but most people keep their jobs. You have 7, 8, 10% inflation, and everybody feels it. And they feel it not just at the supermarket, where they can maybe make their peace with it, but they feel it in financing the houses over their heads, where they really can't. So that's, you see the power of that issue. But Canadian politicians on a different timeline also need to just ask themselves, is inflation going to be as bad 2 years from now as today? And I, of course, do not know the answer to that question, but it is looking like the interest rate rises and the other measures are having some bite. And if that's true, the main lesson I impart to all opposition parties in all Westminster countries is the one we talked about recently, which is do not make plans too far in advance. You do not know. It is impossible to know the issue map 2 years out. So the important thing is to focus on fundraising and candidate recruitment and internal development, and not to commit too hard to any line of attack on the government of the day.
A lot of insight there, as there's been throughout this conversation. David, it's great to catch up, and I look forward to speaking to you again in a couple of weeks.
Thank you. Me too. Bye-bye.